The easiest thing someone can do is the first principle of the Canary Code, which is participation. So invite people to participate and ask them what they need, how do they work best, and how can we work together to eliminate nonsense and focus on achieving outcomes in the most effective and efficient way.
You're listening to episode 46 of the Happy Space podcast. Today I'm exploring dignity, autism, and neurodiversity at work with author of The Canary Code, Ludmila Praslova. Hi, I'm Clare Kumar, your proudly neuroatypical host, exploring the intersection of productivity and inclusivity. I believe that everyone ought to be able to make their richest contribution, but too often people are excluded from spaces, cultures, and experiences. We can do better. I hope that you find inspiration and encouragement in these conversations, for everyone deserves a happy space. When I invited Melanie Diesel, who was my last guest on the podcast, to talk about her late diagnosis of autism, I had no idea it was going to lead me into a huge line of personal inquiry into the trait. And I had already lined up this interview with Ludmila Praslova, also a late diagnosed autistic woman, about her upcoming book. Her book is actually launching right now, The Canary Code. And when I had invited both of these women to join me, I had no idea that I was going to be embarking on this journey. Well, since interviewing with Melanie, I have pursued the tests that she recommended after we spoke, and also a diagnosis, a formal diagnosis. And yeah, it turns out, to my great surprise, that I am autistic as well. I had no idea. Autistic, ADHD, all of this is present. And it's amazing to me, 56 years old, and had zero idea. My belief that was based on my limited understanding of the trait of autism, that because I could look people in the eye, there was no way that autism applied to me. And even though I identified as a highly sensitive person for 10 years and had heard talk that perhaps there was a connection or a blurry line, or even that some highly sensitive people are autistic, I thought that does not apply to me. So it was really, really eye-opening when I spoke to Melanie and then pursued and received the diagnosis just before my conversation with Ludmila Praslova. Now, that made me, as you can imagine, very, very excited about the conversation, because now not only was I curious as an advocate for neuroinclusivity, which is what prompted me to invite both Melanie and Ludmila in the first place, I was really interested in the conversation because now I had a million questions, which is an autistic trait, by the way, to have all the questions, and they apply to me. First of all, let me introduce her. Ludmila Praslova is, of course, an autistic woman. She is a global expert for talent strategy and management. She's a professor of graduate industrial organizational psychology, and I've had the privilege of joining Ludmila's class one evening, which was a lot of fun, before I knew anything about autism, or not anything about, or that it applied to me. And her brand new book is called The Canary Code, a guide to neurodiversity, dignity, and intersectional belonging at work. And as someone who has long identified as a canary, you can imagine my excitement. So we chat about things like the degree to which people understand autism, because clearly my understanding was limited and really, um, really too narrow. And I think it's really important to now fully understand the way that autism is classified. We talk about the DSM-5, where what it gets right and where there's a lot of room for improvement. We talk about the difference between, you may have heard of regular burnout. Well, there's such a thing as autistic burnout as well, and we explore what's the difference. We look at why people who are autistic, or autistic people, have a perception of lacking empathy. And what's that about? We look at the fine line between unmasking and modifying our ways of being to take care of others. And most importantly for me, I got to finally understand why I am so compelled to see it and say it. Speak up, sister. Hashtag no filter, all the things. So please, I hope you enjoy this conversation. If you're curious about how to build a more inclusive organization, Ludmila's work will be invaluable. That intersectionality that she talks about, it was definitely at play for her. It's definitely at play for me. There are, one of the things I learned about autism, there are a lot of co-occurring conditions, muscle tension, inflammatory issues. It's not just the cognitive processing. There's a lot more that goes along with it, and a lot more makes sense for me from an intersectional point of view as well. So if you're a leader, this is for you. If you are a neurodivergent employee, this is for you. And if you are an ally and want to better support this community, this book is for you. Check out Ludmila's writing as well online. Just Google search her name and you'll find all kinds of articles in major publications. What I think you'll be impressed with and what really stood out for me in our conversation was her open thinking and her calm compassion. You'll hear how the way she answers questions and how she's thoughtful and inclusive as a way of being. I fell in love with Ludmila in her writing. I fell in love more with Ludmila every time I've had the chance to speak with her, and I hope you'll fall in love with Ludmila as well. Please enjoy our conversation. Ludmila, I am so thrilled that you're joining me. You have been in my heart and in my head, and I've been so excited for this conversation because you are bringing a very, very important piece of work to the world. I have a question for you to start, and it's, informed by my own journey, which for a decade has been identifying as someone who's highly sensitive. And just 48 hours ago, I got a diagnosis of autism as well. So I've been coming to look at autism with a new, fresh lens. And I realized I had a very narrow perception of autism. I had one informed by probably early pictures by Rain Man, by Sheldon on Big Bang Theory. And my eyes have been opened substantially. My question to you is, how well do you think autism is understood in the world we live in?
Very poorly. And as you said, Rain Man and Little Kid Next Door are usually the kinds of stereotypes that people think of. So, for example, female presentation is very poorly understood for a long time. Women were denied diagnosis because they wore makeup or they had polite manners. Also, people who did not have intellectual disability or significant learning disabilities had very hard time getting diagnosis because even though autism is neither intellectual disability or learning disability, in many people's minds, those were confused. So many people who, for example, were academically accomplished, people would be automatically saying, well, you don't look autistic based on, your grades or whatever.
Mhm.
So it's been a very difficult journey, I think, for many people in obviously in anyone older than young millennials, but even some younger people, even some Gen Zs, have not been diagnosed as children, but that is much more prevalent in like Gen X because uh, not just general public and not just managers, but even many clinicians had a very limiting idea of autism based on a little boy with traits.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been disclosing that I've been curious about it and exploring this, and people's facial expressions like, you? What are you talking about? And so for me, my eyes were really open when I interviewed Melanie Diesel on what will be the episode just as a preface to this one. And there were so many aha moments that went off saying, wait a minute, that's my experience. That's my experience. Things like asking all the questions, things like having to speak the truth. And I have to say, when I was reading your book, there was a line that jumped out at me, and I've been looking for research that helps explain my strong, strong compulsion to speak up when I see unfairness, my clinging to the need for logic. I realized I don't need to cling to being right, but I really hold logic really dear. And so those were things that I had no idea were part of the autistic way of being.
And there definitely is research connecting autistic way of thinking and very strong sense of justice.
Mhm.
There is also a strong sense of justice and desire to kind of fight for justice, also associated with ADHD.
Yeah.
And for autistic people, it's definitely also a logical consistency when people say one thing and do the other thing, which is we don't do well with hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And definitely there is a lot of societal misunderstanding of those characteristics because very often people are taught to smooth things out, even if it does sacrifice the truth, that does not necessarily agree with autistic mind very well.
Yeah. I'm curious for you, what brought you to your diagnosis and what in that journey helped you more fully understand yourself?
Oh my goodness. Well, again, I was very late diagnosed in late 40s. So I had an entire life and career when people just sometimes probably gave me funny looks, but it was not something that people would associate with autistic characteristics. And I have been diagnosed with depression for almost 20 years, except it never quite fit.
Mhm.
And 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 nothing worked. And it was a
Mm.
very strange kind of depression that didn't quite properly fit the criteria, but it was the best they could think of.
Mhm.
And it it didn't quite fit. Actually, PTSD would fit better, uh, but because that actually much more likely to also overlap with autism. But
Yeah.
eventually, it was a very typical trigger for many in the workplace where you've been very successful for a very long time. You've been excelling what you do because I job matched and job crafted very successfully, that I was very good at what I was doing for very long, and I never needed any kind of accommodations just because of job matching and job crafting.
Mhm.
But then what happens, sometimes people get moved into open office, or they get a new manager, or organizational culture becomes more political or more toxic.
Mhm.
And so in my case, it was several of those things. I got moved into the office that just was not it was super cold. So in this particular
Yeah.
case,
Yeah.
it was not an open office, it was just super cold.
Yeah.
So then I was also getting interrupted a lot during that time.
Mm.
I had to drive more, and I never like driving is not my friend.
Yeah.
It really stresses me out.
Yeah.
And we got more politics at the same time, just, rotating people, just instability. And it's generally very good organization, but that particular period was just not pretty, and just backstabby things, just
Yeah.
things that uh, I tried to just kind of deal with it and kind of force myself to do politics. And I've been overriding my cultural background my entire life.
Today's episode of the Happy Space podcast is sponsored by ClareKumar.com. With sensitivity, curiosity, and courage, I serve 3 groups asking the tough questions that lead to meaningful answers. Number 1, I coach ambitious leaders to design for well-being and achieve next-level work-life integration. Number 2, I mic drop thought bombs, that's bombs as in BALMS, in keynotes and workshops, helping organizations achieve the business imperative that is inclusivity. And 3, I collaborate with brands concerned with respect for well-being on product design, marketing, and PR. If any of this piqued your interest, come find me at clarekumar.com. I'd love to speak with you. Designing inclusive performance together will lead to the richest results.
A lot of autistic characteristics also overlap with characteristics of working class culture.
Mm.
So for a very long time, I attributed my issues with like organizational politics to being working class, because when you're working class, you don't have to fight for credit for your work. So I was just having really hard time with people always taking credit for my work. I'm like, what's going on? And so it was multiple things at the same time. And I knew what I need to do with those people, but I literally couldn't bring myself to do it. And I've been able to override a lot of cultural norms. And I'm thinking, okay, I just need to override those working class cultural norms to deal with all the white collar politics.
Mm.
But it just wasn't just that. It was like, I know what it feels to fight your culture. I've been doing it my entire life
Yeah.
because variety. I'm a class migrant. I'm an immigrant, so I had to fight my culture for a lot of time, or just
Yeah. Fight
kind
for
of
your place
know.
in culture.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, I feel you. I immigrant as well. First, I say I'm a person of some color, kind of
Right.
half and half. Short, smart. None of those things were cool. None so really, really difficult. Like you talk about politics, and that seems to I very unsuccessful thinking about how to work politically because it implicitly to me means you're you're not direct, you're not speaking the truth, you're figuring out how to color things to get what you want, and I am nothing if not straightforward, right? Just
Right.
this clash between honesty and hypocrisy doesn't allow me to do those things. I've had some people say to me, "You should go into politics," and I'm like, "No, I would be dismal. I can't, and I have no poker face." Right?
Right.
I can't pretend. You're going to the expression of all the emotions is transparent. Is that similar for you?
Well, exactly. So that was the issue. I literally couldn't override it. It's my physical brain won't do it.
Yeah.
And I knew exactly what I need to do.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And it's not like even the lack of understanding,
Yeah.
it's just the lack of ability to bring myself to do those things and to, fight people on their level,
Yeah.
because it's just like, mm, I can't do it. So some things are just
It's too
not
big. I call it paying tax throughout the day. We have to pay a tax.
right.
We don't get to choose. It's a mandatory tax, and some things are too much to pay.
Yeah. And I actually have no trouble pretending. I've done acting my entire life. So
Yeah.
sometimes people don't understand, and there are plenty of autistic actors and comedians who are highly successful. So when I'm portraying a character, I can do absolutely anything.
Uh-huh.
But lying in real life is a completely different thing. So sometimes people think, oh, autistic people can't lie. Well, actually, we can act, but yes, lie in ways that go against our values.
Yeah.
That is a very different thing.
Exactly. It's the values clash. And you talk about something called moral injury. Just Google Ludmila Praslova and you'll see so much rich content in numerous articles. And I remember reading about moral injury for the first time in one of your articles. And I think it's such an important concept. I first identified with it as a highly sensitive person and really could articulate, oh my gosh, there's a values clash here. This is why I'm so at odds with it. Can you explain to our listeners what moral injury is if they're hearing this for the first time?
Moral injury was first identified in the context of studying veterans and studying PTSD in veterans.
Mhm.
But it was separate. It was something that went beyond, that involved kind of this being disgusted with what you've done. And they separated it, well, Dr. Shade separated it into threat to mortality versus injury to mortality versus to morality. So it's an injury to our morality when we're forced to do something goes against our values. Our boss tells us to cook books, and we end up with moral injury. We watch our boss lie and misrepresent, even if we're not doing it. We can get a moral injury from that. We can look at our professional organization that's giving advice that's actually harmful to people. That is something that can give us moral injuries. So what I've been saying in those articles that you've read is that it's not necessarily just veterans, something that drastic, but many people in modern workplace experience moral injury because you're forced to do things that are unethical. So let's say toss resumes with non-Anglo names, toss resumes from people who went to school before a certain date because we know that ageism is real.
Yeah.
So there are many ways in which modern workplace pushes people into behaviors that end up being morally injurious.
And for someone with autism and for maybe other people too, what happens when you've been morally injured? What's the consequence of that injury?
It can range from just kind of, if it's a smallish incident, you could just kind of feel
Mm.
bad about yourself. It's
Mhm.
transient. But if it's something that's been chronic or severe, people can develop a variety of psychological effects, guilt, shame,
Mhm.
disgust with yourself, um, to the point of existential crisis.
Wow. Yeah.
And we can also develop physical symptoms. So stress related disease
Yeah.
are all also possible as a result of significant moral injury. So it's a full range of negative feelings, very often self-directed, but then also it could be about my organization, my boss, or my
Mhm.
profession that's, for example, betraying its original values.
Well, yeah.
And most of it is self-directed, but some of it can also be other directed. But a lot of it is just sense of shame and not
Yeah.
living up to your own moral standards.
Yeah. I can imagine in a lot of organizations now, especially those demanding a return to the office, that there's a lot of injury around how organizations are now treating the environment
Oh,
because of
yes,
right?
absolutely.
That's one that just jumps to mind. I'm like, "Do you not see?" You know? Um, Thank you for that. That may lead as well into something a term that I've heard but don't really well understand, and I wonder if it applies to me. In 2007, I ended up beginning to leave my last corporate role, and it was I used language, I say it was the construct of work. The job was fine, but it was getting to the job, underground subway, and having to be commuting into the office daily for a job that I could do 90% of the job, I did an analysis, of course, was on the phone. And I'm wondering, I've heard the term autistic burnout, and I'm wondering if you could help me understand that more fully and how it compares to regular burnout.
Right. So autistic burnout is sometimes described as battery is dead.
Mm.
So it's a very profound um, sense of burnout. And Dora Ramaker is one of the people who wrote a lot about that. And from their perspective, is Autistic burnout is a severe mismatch between resources and demands. So, for a very long time, demands exceed your resources, and you keep pouring from the empty cup, and
Right.
eventually you're left with nothing and unable to function. So
Mm.
that is the classic definition, but I actually do have my own version of what it is.
Okay.
I think that's how I experience autistic burnout, and all of us could experience it somewhat different. Sounds like yours was connected to the fact that there was just a lot of nonsense going on.
It was
Uh,
exhaustion, but
yeah.
chronic overstimulation and
Mhm.
exhaustion. Yeah, from paying tax, too many taxes.
Yes. So a lot of those demands, masking, and sensory overstimulation, all of those things
Mhm,
can definitely add to autistic burnout.
mhm,
But to me, there actually is a very significant link to moral injury because the way I experience autistic burnout,
mm.
again, in my personal uh, experience is very much connected to moral injury. It's just the deep sense of grief over the injustice of the world and just being horrified with human condition and being heartbroken over human condition and just the awful things that humans keep doing to each other. So that's how I experience what I call my version of autistic burnout. There, I would love to do research on that. I haven't had a chance to do it because, you know, time and have to make money with other things. But that think I think moral injury, that's my theory,
Mhm.
moral injury plays a very significant role in many cases that could be classified as autistic burnout, but are actually moral injury. Because I think in my case, autistic burnout came from moral injury.
It resonates with me, and I'll tell you why. So I left the role in 2008, and I think it was a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to interview my boss's boss at the time, and I said, "What was going on then that leadership felt the need to demand my presence in the office?" "Well, we wanted mentorship." And I had got to the point where I thought, no, and I wrote to my old boss, I said, I think we have a values clash. We had a values clash between what you think life should look like and what I think life should look like. And that's where we did not align. And that's where, for me, it was just, it fell apart. So it resonates with me. What's interesting when I think of this, we need your mentorship, there was never any mention of the word mentor or mentorship when we were
Wow.
yeah, I was like, "Really? How important was it then?" You know? So, yeah, so your theory, which I hope you do get to research, yeah, it struck me as wholly unfair, and I tried this is interesting, I tried for a year to negotiate the terms that I wanted. I tried
Mhm.
for 23 years in my marriage to negotiate the terms I wanted in my marriage, and I finally realized I'm not gonna go negotiate my way. I can't find the intrinsic motivation drivers. I couldn't do it. So, yeah, so thank you for painting your picture of autistic burnout. I think you're onto something. I want to come now to leaders because this Canary Code, the Canary Code book is really written for the workplace and for people in a position of leadership to understand what they can do more effectively to invite the participation of those with autism and those who are neurodivergent. What do you think the most if a leader's looking for low-hanging fruit, what are the first and easy things that I could do to have some quick wins in making my team, my culture more hospitable?
Easiest thing someone can do is the first principle of the Canary Code, which is participation. So invite people to participate and ask them what they need, how do they work best, and how can we work together to eliminate nonsense and focus on achieving outcomes in the most effective and efficient way.
Mhm.
The next two principles are focus on outcomes and flexibility. Because very often people think they want something, they want mentorship, for example, or something else, productivity, but they evaluate it by a proxy of someone being in the office, as if you couldn't do productivity and even mentorship in some other form. So instead of measuring the actual things, the actual outcome, whether you're building a relationship with someone or whether you are doing your job, your spreadsheets, your analysis, but they just go with a proxy. Can I see you? Well, you might be actually, instead of mentorship, having conflict with people, and you could be just staring blankly at your screen because you're too fried from your commute. But by their proxy, that that looks like they see you working, and that doesn't make any sense. So if we just ask people what they need, eliminate nonsense, and start looking at outcomes and allow people to achieve those outcomes flexibly. Just define if you want mentorship, okay, let's do mentorship.
Mhm.
But does it mean that I have to be there, all the time?
Mhm.
And so let's just do what makes sense. And that leads to other principles like organizational justice. When something is not working or something was miscalculated, let's look at it again. Transparency and valid measurement. So I think when organizations start embedding this within their cultures and practices and norms, we can eliminate a lot of neurodivergent burnout, and we can also make organizations much more effective and people healthier and happier.
So beautifully summed up. So many important points in the book and very simply laid out there. I connect to it so much because I have actually t-shirts that now read flexibility is inclusivity and autonomy is for adults. Right? It's like,
Exactly.
hello. Yeah. What do you think is, from your perspective, studying organizational behavior? What is in the leaders who are clinging to an older way of doing things and perhaps more autocratic, more just, holding on to that presence? What do you think? Is it just control? I interviewed Kate Lister, and she talked to me about leaders, it's ego and control. What do you think is behind it? I have a
I
theory.
think Oh my goodness. I don't like judging people I don't know and thinking that they're just one thing.
Mhm.
Behavior can look very similar, but motives can be very different. So, in
Yes.
some cases, it's desire for control. You can also start digging deeper, and there could be very significant presence of fear, just existential fear that is taking shape of desire for control. Someone feels like they can't control their life, they're scared of something,
Yes.
and they're trying to control others as
Yeah.
a reaction to it. There
I
could be
made the
all
mistake.
kinds
Yeah.
of,
I made the mistake of saying that to a leader in a meeting that I
they
think
don't like that.
no. And so usually I know in the science it will show that naming an emotion is helpful to calm the emotion, but maybe it's only if you name it yourself, not if somebody else is naming it for you.
Ye-
That was a see it say it moment that I wish I could rewind and just say it internally. Um, but
we
I
all
did
had those.
yeah, I did see the fear there. And as a productivity coach, where I spend a lot of my time, I also had a hypothesis that, we've had this abstract sense of time, which we have tools to our watches, our calendars that help us manage time. But now people have all gone abstract. I used to be able to walk out my office potentially and see my team. And if that's been taken away from me, I think many leaders who have been comfortable with that presence are now missing this productivity infrastructure, if you will, to be able to keep people top of mind, and those traditional triggers for a task need to be rewritten. And no one's said, "Hey, here's how you do that." They've just said, "Figure it out."
In some cases, it is the lack of skill. People
Mm,
don't know how to manage remotely. It does require completely different skill set. It does require a very different type of presence. The influence at the distance is not the same thing as, commanding people when they're there. So it's a combination of things. For some, it's a habit. They don't know any better. They feel like the familiar world is slipping away.
yes.
There are so many individual factors,
Yeah.
and sometimes it's just inertia and habit.
Yeah, there's comfort. I want to put my old slippers on. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you for broadening the ideas. I too don't like to label. That's the one that I hear most often though, is it's a power grab. But I think you're right. There's more to it. And there's a vulnerability in leaders that I think needs to be recognized. And I think what I've been trying to cultivate, I have this total teamwork program where leaders and teams come together to co-create the way they work.
Hmm.
And my invitation is that they see each other as humans and understand how they work and then can design together. So throw out everything and see each other as people with a shared objective. And I don't care about this hierarchy and this assumption that the leader needs to carry the full weight, because that adds pressure. It adds pressure to the whole thing rather than let's problem solve this.
Yes, but our society is very steeped in hierarchy, and that might be one of the other reason autistic people seen as misfits, because autistic people usually just see everyone as a human, and if there's any hierarchy at all, it's a hierarchy of skill and knowledge, and that doesn't always correspond to the official organizational hierarchy, and that's where we get in trouble because other people very much live by whatever the official structure there is.
This is all making sense to me. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I have another question for you. And as I have been reviewing my own life and more of those, oh, I wish I could rewind that thing that I said and that thing that I said and that thing, there's there's an invitation for people to be able to unmask and be more of ourselves. There is also a cause and effect to other people of being very direct. And I have learned, I talk a little bit about how in my elevator, in asking people to wear their mask, maybe not under their chin, but over their mouth, assaulted in the elevator, a couple of times in my elevator, that I needed to refine how I was asking for things to not invite such a hostile result, right? And
Mhm.
so I'm really curious about what, how do we navigate this desire to be direct, truth tell, speak our minds, and the very real need to be conscious of the impact that it's having on those around us to be most effective? Like, how do we step into modulation as a tool rather than as not showing up for a really valid reason?
Right. Well, for the longest time, people use politeness and manners just to lubricate social interactions. That kind of has disappeared. And I'm not entirely sure we're in the better place or the worse place because politeness, just general thing for them to wear a mask, but for you to also kind of ask, you know what, I'm immunocompromised. Can you please put it on? Just kind of make it a nice ask
Mhm.
is something that could eliminate a lot of friction in the society. But the problem also was that traditional societies regulated behavior to the point that it was really hard to be authentic at all. So I think we
Awesome.
need to find the ground where politeness makes sense and we're all expected to do some of the most basic things. But again, I think they should have been wearing their mask. If it was during the quarantine, right?
Is interesting when we look at lubrication, and there's something I think we've definitely lost there collectively. And
Hmm.
so Where do we, yeah, how do we find that personally? Coming back to how direct can I be and where do I need to soften? And I find I'm continually working at softening, which I don't know if that's masking or if that's just learning. What am I doing, Ludmila?
I am not entirely sure where the line is, and it could even be different line for every individual
Mhm.
because again, our cultures layer very significantly over our biology. And so if you think about the person at the core, there might be
Mm.
our temperament, our neurotype, but there are so many layers of social learning
Yeah.
that sometimes it's pretty difficult to separate.
Yeah.
And sometimes the social learning makes sense because societies generally create those cultural norms to basically prevent people from doing harm to each other.
Mhm.
But again, any good thing taken too far starts doing harm to someone. For example, when there are norms that you just always have to bend over backwards and never tell the truth, well,
Mm.
that doesn't really align very well to autistic neurotype. So I think we need to figure out where are just kind of the basic skills that are meant for people to function with each other without killing each other, basically,
Yeah.
because it's helpful, and where it becomes unauthentic and harmful. Where are you actually shrinking yourself? So to me, the break is a dignity, and that's actually something I've been thinking about a lot recently.
Mm.
Very often, let's say women, people from groups that tend to have a little bit less power are taught to demur to others and respect their dignity, but not protect our own dignity.
Yes.
And other people are very aware of their own dignity, but not sufficiently aware of the dignity of others. So to
Mhm.
me, healthy psychological functioning, regardless of neurotype, is understanding your own dignity and preserving your own dignity without violating the dignity of others.
Yes.
So if you prefer not to get sick and you say something like that nicely,
Mhm.
I think you are taking care of your dignity without telling someone you're a jerk, right?
Right.
If you said
Right.
it this way, that would be a problem. That would be a violation of their dignity. If
That's
you're
right.
simply stating your need not to get sick and they take it as violation, I would say they have a problem
Yeah.
because they cannot handle your basic ask
Yeah.
to honor your dignity. And you did not attack their dignity, but they might have an unstable self esteem that requires people to always bow down to them, or something's wrong with the world. Now, if you're dealing with that kind of person,
Mhm.
then that kind of person is going to have a very hard time respecting other people's dignity because it's all about them
Yeah.
and they want hierarchically to be above others. So if we live in a hierarchical world, we are sacrificing our dignity to others and we're people pleasing, or we're sacrificing others' dignity and we're jerks. So what we need to find is a balance of preserving our dignity and having healthy boundaries without violating other people's dignity. And I realize this is difficult, but this is something I've been thinking about quite recently. I'm hoping to write about that soon. That when we find that balance, that's really is a key.
Yeah.
If what I am doing in some way violates someone's dignity and I didn't think about it, and it could have been if I told my boss, you know what, you have psychological problems in a meeting, to think about that, that's probably one of those cases when we didn't mean to do it, but we did it.
Yeah.
Uh, and other cases, very often, someone is really being horrible to us, and we say nothing. And in this particular case, we have sacrificed our own dignity,
Mm.
and that is something where we need to put a boundary on. And very often, autistic people are taught to sacrifice your needs for other people's comfort. And I think many do become people pleasers, and we need to address that. But there also could be some who were raised, oh yeah, you get away with murder because you have whatever, and that's not cool either. I mean, there are people who have severe limitations,
Yeah.
and sometimes they just can't help themselves. But there are people who can help themselves but don't, and they are
Yeah.
hurting others. Hurting others is not cool
Yeah.
unless you literally are unable to control it. But sometimes we can and we don't, and that's a problem.
Yeah, I can see how the line would vary for depending on the person, depending on
Right.
cultural upbringing and I mean, as we look at our populations merging so much more, immigration is massive in Canada right now. And we're seeing, I mean, we're a very diverse population in Toronto, but if you
Hmm.
travel 4 hours north, it goes from 50%, over 50% non-Caucasian to 4%. So it's dramatically different depending on where you are. And I think as we see the immigration spread, this is going to be an interesting thing for culture to understand. And I think whatever we're talking about here has a part to play in how we navigate this increasing diversity of population, whether it be neurotype or cultural, different
Well,
cultural types.
usually people are able to create third cultures, and successful multinational organizations do that, which is, I don't know why people still doing. We were doing it 30 years ago
Yeah.
when I was doing global diversity. We knew to create a third culture with culture ed organizations
Mhm.
without forcing one culture on everybody. It
Yeah.
works. You
Yeah.
just kind of create this blend of various traditions, and nobody has to feel bad about who they are. So it's possible. But the problem, of course, happens when people start saying, no, only my culture is right and yours is wrong. And there is absolutely no middle ground and no negotiation. And we take no prisoners, my way or highway. That's where we start getting in trouble.
So yeah, any company merger even. And when you need to go from us and them to togetherness, you need a whole leadership mindset shift to bring that in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Um, I want to come back to this idea that these perceptions of autism as potentially lacking empathy. Um, and I wonder, my thinking is that it might stem from this directness that we're very good at seeing and saying, and not perhaps softening or articulating those other thoughts. And well, the memory that came back to me is when I was about 12 years old, our family went for one therapy session together. And I remember in that session that one of the comments from the therapist was, Claire, you can tell that you love and care for your family very deeply, but the way things come out, your expression of love and care may not make them feel loved and cared for. So I would be too direct and for them. And I'm wondering if you think that's related, that directness of just this is fact, therefore I should share the facts. Do you think that's related to the perception?
Some people could perceive directness as lack of empathy, but there is more than that,
Mhm.
because when autistic people show empathy, it's very often in different ways. So typically, people expect empathy to be demonstrated in words, and saying something nice, and the particular kinds of words are listening and responding in this expected way.
Right.
Autistic people do not necessarily respond in that way. Sometimes autistic people respond by giving information, and information sharing is one way we express empathy, and many neurotypicals find it extremely offensive, because that's not how they express empathy and how they expect it to be expressed.
Right.
Sometimes autistic people express empathy by doing something without even telling people. They would just go and quietly do something for them.
Mhm.
And that's unexpected. And that's not even seen as a sign of empathy. And there you met one autistic person,
Yeah.
but there could be many others who are so overwhelmed by emotional empathy, they actually don't have resources to express it, and their cognitive empathy is just like doesn't have words. Sometimes it's inability to recognize emotion with alexithymia, but sometimes it's just being physically overwhelmed with empathy to the
Mhm.
point of freezing. So I know that's how we experience empathy. I can be overwhelmed to the point where I'm just not functioning. And obviously, people experience that as a lack of empathy, but actually, the person feels so much empathy, they short circuit.
Wow. Yeah, yeah.
So, there are all kinds of different ways in which autistic people experience empathy differently from neurotypical people, and those ways are very often misinterpreted.
Again, a much richer understanding now. Thank you so much for that, because I had just one sort of hypothesis and you've really helped it flesh it out. I have one more question for you around disability at work and accommodation. And
Hmm.
so I understand that autism is clearly in the DSM-5. It's treated as a disability. And the way I understand it, if I've read correctly, there are three levels, 1, 2, and 3. And 1 needs some support, 2 needs more support, and 3 needs a lot of support. Um,
Yes. Lots of people disagree with it, but that is what DSM says,
yeah.
DSM-5.
Well, before we go to my question, which deals with accommodation and disability, can you share a little bit for me and people listening? How do you view it, and how, I mean, this has been around since 2013 now, DSM-5, I believe.
Mhm.
What do you think is on the mark, and what do you think is perhaps needs to be revised, and in what kind of direction? Or is that
I'm not a
difficult to
clinician. I'm
Yeah.
not a clinician, and they actually did kind of revise it recently, making it harder for some people who have lower needs to qualify, uh, but lower support needs. But I think it's still pretty narrow in presentation, does not account for presentation in highly intelligent people.
Mm,
I think it still mixes up autism and intellectual disability. I
mm,
think that those need to be more clearly separated, because I think what's level 3 is actually a mix of autism and intellectual disability.
mm,
And sometimes people still are considered um, very significantly impacted if they don't communicate verbally,
mm.
even though they're actually brilliant, and
Yeah.
all they need is help in communicating in nonverbal ways. I don't think DSM picks up on that. So I think they need to further clarify uh, the motor inability to produce sound with inability to think. That's one of the things that's missing. And then also disentangling how uh, autistic characteristics could be manifested in women, in people with very high level of intellectual functioning, because I think that is very lost and very mixed up. But again, I'm not a clinician.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I appreciate a non-clinical view because people living with autism need to parse all this out and find some sense of it too, right? So and I'm running into people who are like, "What? No, this doesn't make any sense." So it helps me understand a bit of the evolution when they removed Asperger's from the DSM-4,
Mhm.
and I think because of historical reasons and associations and so on.
Yeah.
But I've heard some comments that it was like that was not helpful.
It's you will hear different opinions, and some people just were really attached to ASPE identity, and I
Mm,
was diagnosed too late to
yeah.
kind of develop that identity. So I say autistic, and I'm fine with it.
Yes.
But for some people, it's kind of an identity loss,
Yes.
and it also leads to conflicts between community over resources. So people always come to blows over whether autism is a disability. Someone says autism is not a disability, and other people say, yes, it is a disability.
Yeah.
And the fact is, some people do not identify as disabled.
Hmm.
And there are variety of reasons why they could be in the right environment where
Yeah.
they have enough resources to cope. If the
Yeah.
same person was the
Yeah.
environment where they did not have resources to cope, they might consider themselves disabled or
Mhm.
not. We don't
Well, so
know.
thinking of the corporate world, and I go back to my situation and I rewind to 2007, and I think, huh, if I had an autism diagnosis, would I have been able to negotiate my way into some accommodations? And I
Yes.
think yes. Whereas highly sensitive people, 1 in 5 potentially, they got nothing to point to. And they've got, so we live in this disability, medical model of disability still. And
Yes.
so what, this is the question I'm really interested in the workplace. How are we moving the needle on that? Or is it still very economics driven? And what I've heard out of leaders' mouth is, oh, we have an accommodation process. Doctors know accommodation, full stop. I'm interested in that, never mind the labels, diagnosis is privilege, flexibility is inclusivity, all the inclusivity slogans I've been talking about for years, because I think we need to move the conversation in that direction. How difficult do you think it is for an organization to embrace that thinking? Is it fear of expenses? Is it fear of opening the floodgates to people saying they need things? What's going on that keeps us fixed on this medical model?
There are organizations, and I talk about several of them in my book,
Mhm.
that were founded to be flexible and majority autistic, majority neurodivergent.
Yeah.
That did not hurt their bottom line at all. Flexibility is given to everyone,
Yes.
and the company is doing just fine. So people who are saying it's expensive or people are going to abuse it, they are excuses. They haven't done their math. They have no idea what things cost, and they're just assuming. And they are afraid that some people are going to take advantage. And yes,
Mhm.
someone is going to say they have ADHD or whatever, and they don't have it, and
Yeah.
the whole issue.
Yeah.
Um, it's it's kind of a situation where bias is very deeply rooted, mistrust is very deeply rooted, and ideally people would understand that giving flexibility to everyone makes a lot more sense, and it would make many accommodations unnecessary. But
Mhm.
for many people, yes, it definitely is driven by accommodations. And now I try to be an optimistic person, but I'm going to say something dark that I have read somewhere in an article, um, that I can't remember the citation, but I can find it if I need to. That basically, the only way the society gives something to disabled people is if it becomes a new convenience for everybody. Because otherwise, society will not give an inch to disabled people. And you can see this happening with work from home. It was considered not an appropriate accommodation, right? And up until pandemic, and now that all kinds of people can work from home, now it's much more acceptable as a disability accommodation. So this is a very cynical view, and I try not to be this cynical, and I try to go with a more positive view that let's just eliminate nonsense and focus on outcomes and let people work flexibly, because parents can benefit and so forth.
Yeah.
Because um accommodations, one thing that I always stress, it's in my book, it's in everything I say, accommodations is not disability inclusion. People can grudgingly give you accommodations and treat you like garbage and bully you.
Yeah.
So society needs a much more significant shift than accommodations under the disability model. Unfortunately, that kind of societal shift does take a lot of time.
Mhm.
So, under what we're dealing with now, many people do need accommodations and they do need a diagnosis. And this is not the optimal world in which I want to live in, but it's the world in which we're currently living in. And again, I have some ideas for how to change it, but I'm also not delusional
Yeah.
in thinking that we're going to change it in 3 months, because we won't. We can
Yeah.
change a few social norms pretty
Yeah.
quickly, but to change the whole complexity of the society, that takes a long time.
Takes time. Now, what I think about, not to pile on the negativity, but I think of ergonomics, right? And in 1995, I was lobbying to the president of the company to have some conscientiousness around keyboards and the right equipment, because I saw people walking around with carpal tunnel braces on.
Hmm.
And I'm like, so I've seen the business case be built for proper ergonomics. And now it's much more, oh, yes, we understand that we have to do these things to be proactive and preventative. And I'm seeing a parallel. The same needs to happen to invite all the neurotypes to be able to participate, right? So we need to do this because, but I do think, and I want to know what you think about this. I saw UK research recently that talked about the number of lawsuits that mention neurodiversity. From, I think, 2017, there were 3. Last year, 284.
Hmm.
So there's a massive exponential rise, the same with there was with ergonomics and injury cases. Do you think that the lawsuits are going to help the understanding that this is better for everybody, that this might further our journey?
Unfortunately, organizations do respond to lawsuits and money.
Mhm.
So, as much as I personally find it distasteful,
Yeah.
it actually might help to get people to be more aware, because um, as much as I wish organizations simply cared about human dignity and did the right thing,
Yeah.
unfortunately, in many cases, we have people in power who respond to compliance and bottom line concerns.
Yeah.
So, yes, unfortunately, that might be one of the levers to make society better. Now, when they've been doing it for a while, they might start seeing the point that it really is better for everyone. And I
Mm.
would prefer not to start with legal compliance,
Mhm.
because I think traditional DI has hit a lot of those roadblocks because it was born out of the legal compliance rather than
Yes.
the
Yeah.
genuine desire to do the right thing.
Yeah.
But it is one of the faster ways to get relief to some people, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now personally in the work that I do. What's the hook to have somebody pay attention? And maybe that's enough to say, have a look at what's happening. But the arguments are not those arguments. Let's look at that. But it's to try and ignite attention. But I take your point very seriously that that's where there's DEI fatigue. So I was at Work Human in Austin last week, and I heard somebody say, well, a lot of people are dissing DEI and saying didn't earn it is the acronym. And I thought, oh, wow, wow, that is not where we're going with this. So it's
Hmm.
about understanding humanity at a more deep level and making room for all the talent that has something to offer.
Right.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, people come from different mindsets.
Yeah.
And when I wish I could only talk about human case, because to me it doesn't make any sense. Why do we have to justify somebody's existence and right to not suffer by someone else's bottom line? That doesn't
Right.
make any sense to me. Unfortunately, I don't make any sense to people to whom the world is hierarchical and I'm rich and everyone else has to justify their existence by being beneficial to me.
Yeah.
So we have to keep bringing up this business case, even though very often it's just an excuse, because yes, bring me the numbers that it helps, but we can't give you the numbers if we don't try. But we're not going to try if you don't give us the numbers.
That's
So
22.
it's a game,
Yeah.
and it's a highly problematic game that has been going on for a long time.
Mhm.
Um, so not everyone comes from just do the right thing mindset.
Yeah.
And sometimes I try to, go to the win-win argument, which is what we've been talking about today.
Yeah.
Uh, so if you're nice to people, they're more productive.
Yeah.
If you treat them with respect and as humans, they're more productive. And it's unfortunate we have to make this argument that treating someone with human dignity has to be justified by the fact that this person is going to be more productive. And I wish we could just tell everybody just do the right thing.
Yeah. But as we
But
know, look at Nike, right? Their "Just Do It" tagline takes on a whole new meaning now. They've said, "Just do it in the office 4 days a week." Right? I was
yeah,
like, hang on a second. Um, Ludmila, this conversation has answered many of my questions and probably sparked some new ones as well. It's been really enlightening. I want to invite everyone to hear from you. Where should they find the Canary Code? Where should they yeah, let them know where to find you and the Canary Code. What should people look out for?
I am very easy to find. If you Google my name, Ludmila Praslova, I come up. I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn. I have a pretty unique name, which could be bad and good. If you're trying to find me, it's a good thing. If I'm trying to sell myself for a lot of money, it's not good because people don't like foreign names and you get quite a bit of discrimination out of it, but that's besides the point. And you can find the Canary Code uh, pretty much anywhere. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, wherever you typically buy books. It is in some local bookstores, not in every one, but it is in local bookstores. Obviously, online, the big online book retailers might be the easiest way to find it, but I would be thrilled if people have read it and gifted their bosses a copy, gifted their HR a copy, because I think those are people who really need it.
Yeah.
The book is written for managers, HR, DI people. Uh, so it's specifically kind of tailored to what they can do on the organizational side. But obviously, any neurodivergent person will also find ways to advocate for themselves, the terminology they will use. So it's absolutely something that is written for uh, the managers and HR, but it is also absolutely written in a way to be helpful to the employee who is neurodivergent. And there are some portions that could even be helpful to solopreneurs, entrepreneurs, even though it is written mostly for traditional workplace.
Mhm.
But there are some chapters about work organization, for example, that could actually work for anyone, even if you're just managing yourself.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much, Ludmila. I know it's a really busy time. The book is out May 7th. So I'm so excited for you on this journey. And you know what I'm really excited about are the next questions you're going to have. because you're
Goodness.
right. So I am staying close with you because I'm a big fan, and I can't wait to keep spreading your work. It's brilliant.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate all you do with this podcast and bringing awareness to common sense and logic and flexibility in the workplace.
Doesn't have to be hard.
No, and it makes us much happier.
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much, Ludmila.
It's fun to be with you, Claire.
Thanks so much for spending time here. Check out happyspacepod.com for links to all the episodes, including on YouTube, our online community, and helpful tools for work that fits. I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment on social media, or even better, drop a review. And please share with someone else who you know also deserves a happy space.